Hello, good afternoon. My name is Lewis Croft. Welcome to the Pub Affairs webinar on the DMA. So just rules of the road at the top. This is a public conference, so this is not under the Chatham House rule. So anything you hear is on the record, including what I say. This is an event about the Digital Markets Act, which you all know, and you will have all been reading about yesterday on the conclusion of the European Parliament's position on the vote. The title is Protecting the Consumer Interests, so we'll be looking into the state of the negotiations, which obviously is going to launch into trilogues at the beginning of next year, and seeing where what some of the effects might be of some of the amendments and the general position, taking the temperature on the talks. I won't do the disservice of talking through the DMA. Basically, it was proposed a year ago, and it's going to designate some very large websites as gatekeepers, and it's going to apply about 20 restrictions to them. They've been moving through different forms and different ways, different articles over the past year's worth of discussions, but we'll get onto that ourselves, and you can hear from the other people who will say much more sensible things about it than I will. So we are going to run the event in the following way. First up, we're going to hear from Gareth Shier, who's a principal in the digital markets and competition group at Oxera, The Economist, and he's going to give us an overview of a recent report he's authored on the DMA, and this focuses on the potential unintended consequences for consumers of some of the amendments in the IMCO Internal Market Committee report in the European Parliament. We'll then move on to a panel discussion with our other speakers. Unfortunately, to bring you yet more COVID news, Nia Zuber, who was going to speak on behalf of the European Commission, she's head of the DG Comp's team dealing with the DMA at the moment. She's been struck down and she won't be joining us today. So sorry for that, but also our thoughts go to her and her family as she's doubtless struggling through it. We will move on to hear from Annabelle Gawer. She's director of the Centre of Digital Economy at the University of Surrey. She's done a lot of work in this area, producing reports, which she'll tell you about. And then we're going to move to hear from Jebelli, who will be known to many of you as well. He's competition counsel at the CCIA, the Computer and Communications Industry Association. It's got many members, but I think it's safe to assume that some of them will be designated as gatekeepers under the DMA. So after we've heard from them, we'll then start a panel discussion. I've got plenty of questions. I'm sure you have as well. If you do, please put them into the chat box. I will fish them out, delete the swear words, and put them to our speakers. So please do keep them coming, and I'll try and moderate them and point them towards the right people to get a good debate going. So without further ado, Gareth.
Thanks, Lewis. Okay, let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep, all looking good.
So thanks very much for inviting me to speak with you guys on this panel. Like you said, we've been looking at some at the DMA with the CCIA, and we're currently working on a report looking at the amendments. But I actually wanted to start with a report that we did back in May time, when the DMA had, shortly after the DMA had been first announced by the Commission, looking at the original text and thinking about the proposals that were put there. We were struck by this, by these remarks made by Commissioner Breton in a blog post at that time, where Commissioner Breton, talking about the DMA, said that it's addressing a list of clearly egregious practices, and that there's no need to spend years analysing the effects of these each time. And in effect, we're kind of calling for a return to more of a form-based approach to the rules in this, with regard to these platforms, rather than the effects-based of competition enforcement. That led us to ask the question, which our previous report focused on, which is, are these practices so clearly egregious? Or is it the case that the market context and the business models that are applying these behaviours really matter, and that we need a little bit more of that case-by-case assessment? So while it's true that a lot of the obligations of the DMA are based on the context of specific antitrust cases, and you've seen some nice mappings of cases that have happened to the obligations that you see represented in Articles 5 and 6. I think you do have to think about the breadth of different platform business models that are out there and the types of markets that they are addressing. I mean, even within the large firms that might be expected to be caught by the DMA, there are different business models creating quite different incentives for those operators. As a ready example, take the mobile operating systems of Apple and Google. Both mobile operators both allow you to use your phone, but they've come at it from very different perspectives. Apple's a hardware-based, services-based monetization model with a focus on privacy, reliability. It's quite a closed system. Google's a very open system. It's given away for free to third parties. It's monetized through cross subsidies from the advertising that's generated around the other services that Android offers. These differences have quite an effect on how these platforms want to engage with the users and the third parties within their ecosystem. Secondly, if we think about the behaviors that are being targeted by the DMA that can be harmful, there's also great examples of where they can be beneficial to consumers depending upon the circumstances. And this is a core focus of our previous report. We think about three broad groups of behaviors: self-preferencing behaviors, time and bundling behaviors, and leveraging behaviors. And we think about how they can, whether there are these examples of where these can be beneficial. So take, for example, self-preferencing. On the one hand, it can mean a dual role operator gaining an advantage by promoting its own goods and services. On the other hand, it can mean a firm promoting security and reliability within its platform by vertically integrating complementary services. An example could be Apple Pay, which is giving me the choice to opt into a more closed system. And I must say, I'm one of those people who slightly prefers to use Apple Pay. My perception, irrespective of the technical reality, my perception is that is a more secure service that I would like to use. And similarly, bundling and tying, it can be positioned as firms requiring a user to take their own products or services that may create a risk of foreclosure. However, it could also mean firms adding innovative services to their core platform that brings me, the consumer, more convenience. And I think of, say, Facebook Marketplace adding on functionality to Facebook, a service I'm already using. I'm already seeing users, or Facebook's already seeing users exchanging goods on Facebook using standard groups. Standard groups become buy and sell groups become marketplace, enhancing that functionality for consumers by bundling a additional service. And finally, we thought about sort of the leveraging of data. And again, this is often framed as a data advantage that might help entrench position. But on the flip side of that, you've got firms using the resources at their disposal to offer a more personalized and tailored experience. And you see that all the time with recommendations engines on a marketplace, or localized search results that give you the coffee shop that's near to you instead of all the coffee shops in the south of England or in Brussels or whatever. So thinking about this need to look at the context and the business model, it sort of becomes clear that the DMA's one-size-fits-all approach, while maybe intended to address short-run contestability and fairness questions, runs the risk of eroding some of the value that platforms can create for consumers. And I think we'd like to see a bit more focus on consumers within the discussion, rather than assuming that they are necessarily well served by increased contestability every single time. But to do that, we first need to have a bit more of an understanding of how platforms are creating value. So, unlike the traditional industrial organizational literature, which is the workhorse of the competition economics frameworks, we've been looking at the management economics literature around platforms, which emphasizes some quite different features. First of all, that literature sees platforms as more of a new organizational structure. These structures are orchestrators of complex ecosystems. They bring third parties together, typically around maybe a core technology, such as an operating system or web service or piece of hardware. And then those platforms profit by sharing in the value of that ecosystem. And that's giving them a natural incentive to maximize their ecosystem value. And to do this, platforms play an important governance role, balancing the competing needs and interests of the different groups of users that are on their platform. For example, it might manage the degree of openness to third parties. That's to say, how much do I invite people to innovate on my platform versus how much do I close my platform and maintain more control over integrity and security. In some cases, it can mean managing the behaviors and the interactions of users. I want to make sure that those interactions are of a high quality and engaging for my consumers. And that needs what we might term a bouncer's right to keep bad actors or unsavory actors out of my ecosystem if necessary. And finally, we find these platforms manage the externality effects that can occur from these interactions. So that can be the knock-on effect of advertising within an ecosystem. For advertisers, obviously, that's creating an important funding source for maintaining the platform. But for users, it's perhaps degrading the experience if there's an excess of advertising. Finding that balance is really important. There's also a question of cost subsidization here. How much do I charge different groups of users to make sure that we have the groups coming together, managing that multi-sidedness of the platform? So what we see on the slide here is that platforms use these tools to unlock value for users, both in the short run and the long run. We think of three layers of value creation, starting with intermediation at the most basic short run static layer. And intermediation is the bringing together of the most basic function of bringing together different parties in order to facilitate an interaction. That might be a trade on a marketplace. It might be a communication on a social media device, or it might be a one-way message, like for advertising on a web service or something. I think when I look at the DMA, I think this seems to be the focus of the instrument currently, trying to maximize these direct and indirect network effects that happen at the intermediation level. But it's important for us to think about the fact that good platform governance goes beyond just this short run and actually builds on that with additional layers of value creation over the medium and the longer run. So take the aggregation layer. What we think of here is bringing together a wide range of complementary services. It makes it easier and cheaper for businesses and consumers to trade by bringing third parties into the ecosystem. That's increasing choice for consumers. It's giving them more options. It's unlocking scale economies as you create complementarities in demand. You're putting products that people want to consume together, driving up demand for both. We then think of the third layer of innovation. And platforms play an important long-run role promoting innovation, both on their platform, but also between platform ecosystems. On the platform, remember, platforms share in the value of the ecosystem they create. So they've got a natural incentive to foster innovation among complementers within their ecosystem. So an example of that is where Android provides incentives such as revenue sharing. It provides tools such as access interoperability tools and development toolkits to help people develop on the platform. They also want to compete between ecosystems. So building a high quality ecosystem attracts people in, builds the value of that ecosystem that you can then share in. That can mean incorporating new products, new features and services. It can mean innovating around the business model to spur more on-platform innovation. And if you think about it over time, we see this this evolution of different ecosystems. You can think from the desktop ecosystems of Windows, Apple, move to more online ecosystems of Google and Facebook and others, and then there's the mobile ecosystems of Apple and Google, video and voice ecosystems of Google and Amazon, and now we're moving towards the metaverse that Facebook is introducing us to as well. So we see this evolution of different ecosystems through different technologies and through this dynamic long-run competition. Moving on now to our forthcoming report, thinking about the amendments that have been proposed to that DMA text. We've done a review of a selection of those amendments, and we find that there's changes for better and for worse. We focused on the amendments relating to three broad categories of obligation: data separation, product, service and integrations, and interoperability. I want to walk through some examples of how these amendments could have unintended consequences for consumers before highlighting a few of the areas that we think are going to be more beneficial for consumers. So firstly, thinking about data separation. The provisions of Article 5A have remained largely unchanged by the amendments, and 5A requires platforms to gain user consent before they can combine their data. Now, this is thinking about consumers' rights over their own data and their privacy rights. However, Parliament's amendments to Article 36 start to make an unrealistic demand of platforms, because the text in Article 36 requires that the less personalized alternative that a platform must offer, if I choose not to combine my data, not to allow you to use my data, must be of an equal quality. It can't be a degraded quality. But this misses the point of the fact that personalization can be a dimension of quality. In some cases, a service needs my personal data, needs access to combine that data in order to be able to provide the service to me. And an example of that could be Google users can see all of the settings, their privacy settings, their usage settings in one place with their Google account dashboard. But that necessarily requires access to combine my personal data from across the ecosystem. In other cases, services are improved based upon the data that is collected. And we can think of two types of improvement. There's within user learning, as it's called in the literature, where it learns about me and it makes personalized recommendations to me. And there's between user learning, where it learns about how people in general behave. You might think of some instances where between user learning allows the same benefit to be offered to a personalized and non-personalized user. If it's learned, for example, that a seller on a marketplace is unreliable, that same information can be used for both groups. In other cases, like a recommendations engine, that's personal to me. It needs to be using my personal data in order to offer me that higher quality service. Requiring that all the personalized and the less personalized be 100% equivalent effectively prohibits that personalization. It means that platforms can't offer the higher quality personalized service to me. Now, in contrast to the Parliament, the Council's amendments to Recital 36 do recognise that and actually put in a exception for the case where quality depends on personalisation. Next, thinking about product and service integration, Article 61D prohibits self-preferencing, favouring in rankings or other services. And Parliament's addition to Recital 48 specifies that the preferential or embedded display of services will constitute such a favouring. Now, this is an example of where the provisions would effectively prohibit the integration of complementary services by a platform. And we take Google Maps as an example. Google Maps is often embedded in general search results. And that's good for consumers because it provides me with greater convenience and higher quality search results when it's displaying geographic data more in a more readily accessed format. It's good for Google because it allows deeper integration than you can get with a third party. You can't get the same quality of integration with a third party mapping provider necessarily. And it also gives more trust in the information that's being provided. It's good for businesses or other users that are shown on that map who have input their information into the Google ecosystem, and that information is being reused and when it's being surfaced on the general search results. And actually that particular case it comes up in the Google Street Map case in the UK that happened some years back. The UK High Court confirmed that those benefits wouldn't be equaled with a third-party mapping service. So it actually found, look, this is an example of where complementary services within the ecosystem are offering a better outcome for consumers than a third-party situation could. And finally then, on interoperability and interconnection, Parliament's new Article 223B specifies a wide definition for interoperability. It requires a deep integration that goes beyond just managed API access or software applications for conversion. And that's reducing the ability of platforms to manage the degree of access when offering interoperability. And this definition would apply to both Article 6.1c as amended by the Council and Article 6.1f. And these articles are the ones that are granting interoperability to app developers and to third-party service providers. We discussed earlier that managing openness is one of the tools that platforms use for good governance. And granting excessive openness can be problematic. An example that we draw on in our forthcoming report is around Apple's approach to mobile device management technologies. In particular, the use of those technologies in parental control apps. Around 2017, they started looking into this. MDM is a valuable service at the enterprise level. It allows companies to manage their fleet of devices more easily, but for consumers, it can introduce security risks and it can introduce privacy concerns around children's data being moved onto the parental control app service. So they've implemented rules within the App Store governance to say these aren't allowed to be included in those consumer-facing applications. It's around protecting the integrity of the ecosystem and maintaining that focus on privacy that Apple has. Finally, then, I just want to touch on the highlights of this, and something that we've seen in a number of places. We've cited there Article 5C A as it's been split, 5C, 6.1c, 6.1f. These articles include exceptions to the interoperability and the data separation obligations when it comes to security, integrity, personal data. And these are recognizing that the interconnectedness within the ecosystem means that there can be knock-on effects. And a good example is Microsoft's Defender suite. Microsoft combines insights from across different parts of the ecosystem to better isolate and tackle threats. So it could be that I've received an email that has got a threat in it. It can check different devices that I've been using, who I've been interacting with, and try and isolate that threat. This is a better service for consumers as a result of that data sharing. If I decline to allow my data to be combined in that way, it's having a ripple effect on other people in the ecosystem. It's not just affecting me. Finally, then, we just wanted to touch on the impact these changes could have on platform business models. Looking back at the DMA's impact assessment that the Commission prepared alongside the original proposals, there's this quote here. The impact assessment says it should be stressed that the foreseen interventions will neither ban specific monetization models nor prevent the uptake of services by gatekeepers. And reflecting on some of the changes that we've seen, we feel that the amendments can be at odds with this assessment. And three particular examples. Within Recital 49, Parliament adds a stipulation that gatekeepers should be required to treat their own products or services as separate commercial entities that are commercially viable as standalone services. And this is effectively prohibiting a cross-subsidization model. And in doing so, it's also putting ad funding models at risk, where ad funding is used to cross-subsidize other services. An example of that could be Facebook. Facebook builds its ecosystem around ad funding and funds all of the other services that sit around the Facebook core, the job services, the dating services, the marketplace services, all cross-subsidized by the ad funding of Facebook's core service. If those had to be independently commercially viable services, it would raise questions about whether they are things that Facebook want to launch. Similarly, 6.1f stipulates free access for third parties seeking to interconnect with core platform services. And again, this is undermining a potential revenue stream, a business model that some businesses would like to use, charging a license fee for access to the core technology. And that can have a detrimental impact on their incentives to invest in those services in the first place, undermining that point that it won't prevent the uptake of new services. If I can't charge people for using the services, I have to give that service away for free. My incentive to make the upfront investment is diminished. Then finally, Articles 5C and 5E taken together, and particularly as amended by IMCO and the Council, limit the extent to which platforms can rely on a commission-based business model. We've talked about this in our May report. In the case of online travel agents, and the fact that if a hotel could circumvent the OTA at the time of booking, I mean, you could think of them including a link in the description to say, please book here for 10% off. If that can't be prohibited by the platform, it undermines their core revenue stream. But that same logic can apply to different sales models like app stores, marketplaces, recommendations engines. And it introduces a risk of free riding by users. The platform's business model is to charge at the point of revenue, so you can put your wares out there, you can try out your business idea through our platform. If you're making revenue, we'll take a commission off of it. They'd have to turn to different business models. That could be a licensing fee model. So, a listings fee model. So you have to charge to be listed in the first place. That have an effect on the downstream business users who are making a decision of whether or not to try out a new product. It could mean subscription models for consumers. You have to pay a subscription to use a service instead of getting that service for free. Again, having an impact on the pricing and the availability to different consumers. Overall, I think all of these examples show that with these amendments, the DMA would be having an impact on the business models, would be potentially banning certain business models in a sense, and can affect the uptake of different services. That was all from me.
Thanks, Gareth. Annabelle, over to you.
Thank you. Delighted to be here and for the opportunity to comment on this very important topic. I would like to preface my remarks to say that I believe the reason I've been invited is because of my research in this area of platform strategy, platform management over the last 20 years. You know, I've played a role as an expert member in the European Commission of the Observatory of the Online Platform Economy. Also co-wrote a report, which was a 150-page report for the European Parliament, looking at online platforms' economic and societal effects. I also want to clarify that I do not receive nor have received any payment or consulting fees of any kind by the companies who could be subjected to the gatekeeper rules. So the remarks that I'm going to offer come from a place of academic expertise and one that attempts to stay as neutral and not partisan as possible. This is in the context of very highly contested debates, and I think it's very important to try to to look at the propositions on the merits, and with no particular agenda, be it a political agenda or a business agenda. I would also like to say that the report that I wrote for the European Parliament, the opinion that I have is that I think the DMA is a very good thing. I think that Gareth explained, I think, very well how platforms create value. And I share a lot of what he said. I may disagree on a small number of minor things, whether aggregation and intermediation and innovation are really nested, but that's a detail. And so I think it's very important to look at how platforms create value, but also at how platforms capture value. And I think that the sentiment behind the proposed regulation is justified and legitimate, and that acknowledges that the power of a small number of firms over thousands and thousands of other firms and over the economy in general has become extremely large, that a number of those platforms, the gatekeeper platform, the UK can call them platforms with strategic market status, yes, are creating value in a way that is evident and has been even more evident in times of COVID, where a lot of our activities have migrated online. And at the same time, as Gareth explained, the role that they have in terms of governing the ecosystem has become under a lot more scrutiny. And that is because there is a lot of dependency, we can call it platform dependency, both of individuals and businesses that have come to depend on the services offered by some of these big platforms to do commerce, to buy and to sell, to get their news, and be able to connect to some of the technologies that these platforms offer in order to access markets. And precisely because platforms create value by being central actors that facilitate connections within ecosystems, it is impossible to understand how platforms create value without understanding that the centrality of the platform within an ecosystem is par for the course. I'm sure people in the audience have heard the term network effects as well, which are, technical economic terms to simply say something rather simple, that most of these platforms who bring together multiple sides, so let's say Uber brings together drivers and people who want to be driven. What network effects means, cross-site network effects means that the more users you have on the one side of the platform, the more users are likely to find this platform engaging with the platform worthwhile. And some early work in this literature indicated that when you have very strong network effects, you could have a sort of natural monopolization that happens, a winner-take-all dynamics. Simply by virtue of the fact that the more users connect to a platform, the more valuable this platform becomes for new users. And therefore, there is a momentum and a dynamic that could, under certain conditions, lead to a monopoly outcome. More recent research has shown that this will only happen if it's costly or difficult for users to be able to engage or to connect to multiple competing platforms at once. So if you can have, as a user, Lyft as well as Uber on your phone, that brings a natural competition into the process. If, on the other hand, for behavioral reasons, for example, you are never going to go to Bing because you're quite satisfied with Google, you're going to get more this natural monopoly. The question will be, those of the platforms, and there will be just a very small number of them that will survive early competition, those who not only survive but reach positions of not only centrality but quasi-monopoly, not just on a particular vertical market, but on some key markets that are the foundation or the access to other markets. The question then becomes, how will this platform behave vis-a-vis the users and the businesses that are dependent upon this platform. And the reason I use the word dependent is because if you had competing platforms, or if you have competing platforms and competing ecosystem, then the governance of one particular platform, the rules that this platform is going to design and implement, rules as to who can join the platform, who can do what on the platform, and what kind of consequences, say deplatforming or others, could they mete out towards those who don't behave on the platform. If the users actually have a choice as to migrating to another platform, then the rules of governance of that first platform have less potentially bad consequences than if that platform, by virtue of those natural economic forces that I've described before, if that's the only choice. Okay. So that leads us to an objective, which I think is clear with the DMA, and it's also clear in the digital strategy that the UK Competition and Market Authority has put out, which is the objective of contestability of digital markets. And I think that's a very good objective to have, because if you indeed have a real possibility for newcomers to compete and possibly dislodge the platform, or compete and offer an offering that existing users could migrate towards without having to incur enormous switching cost, then obviously that puts in a different light the rules that are associated with platform governance. What's very interesting about platform governance is that some of those ecosystems that the biggest govern are big individuals and organizations in terms of the volume of transaction that is being conducted over these platforms. Again, we're talking at volumes that are bigger than some national economies. So we have a tradition in democratic countries that you have a separation of powers between those who write the laws and let's say the legislators, the House of Lords, the Assemblée Nationale, and those who implement the laws, who police them, the police, for example, right? What we have in a platform-based ecosystem is you have the same actor that writes the rules and that implements the rule, and that until rather recently, say until the platform to business regulation was not really constrained in terms of they could change the rule from one day to the next, and they were not really recourse. So I think the whole scrutiny over a very small number of platforms as to what can they do is completely legitimate. This being said, I also agree with many of the points that Gareth explained as to the unintended negative consequences of some of these amendments. I think they come from a good place in the sense that they want to minimize the possibility of lock-in. They want to minimize the possibility of unfairness. And I think the sentiment is good. But I would agree that, for example, with the issue of data separation, to write in the law that the non-personalized services should have, equivalent quality than those who are personalized simply cannot happen. And that is because, contrary to, say, the type of products or the type of technologies that we had, for example, in the telecom industry, where you could measure objectively the quality of, say, a particular conduit in terms of, the number of bits or the amount of data that could be transferred along a particular cable. And there is no subjectivity in that. It is a physical measure. If you've got the right instruments, you can measure it. And if there is a consensus that the quality of a telecom cable is associated positively with its bandwidth, then in law it makes sense and it's implementable to say that you cannot differentiate access. For example, if you are an incumbent telecom operator, you cannot offer a less quality to say a newcomer that would by law be able to now connect onto your underlying grid. That makes sense. Economically speaking, it makes sense from a society perspective, and it's implementable because there is no ambiguity as to what quality means in that context. For the kind of digital services that we are talking about, it's more complicated because some users are going to find that to them, not being spied on at all and having no personalization is quality. Some other people will say, I don't care, whatever this platform is doing with my data. I'm willing to trade off some privacy for some increased personalization, okay? And so what we need to be careful about is not to put into law things that are impossible to implement. And therefore, I think it's better to ask for transparency and to put choices in the hand of the users so that they know what they're giving up versus what they're getting, right? And so that's why the proposed amendment, or the amendment which the Parliament has, the Parliament has agreed with the Council, not, and I think the Council is right on this end, better than the Parliament, because again, we don't want to put into law something that is impossible to implement. And we want to make sure that whatever is put into law captures not only the spirit of what we try to achieve, but doesn't shoot itself in the foot by asking things that are impossible to implement. The second point about product and service integration, I would also agree on this point with what Gareth said about how restricting product integration can in some cases degrade quality and reliability. Again, I understand the sentiment that sometimes forced bundling and forced integration reduces the likelihood that a newcomer could come in at the interface, and therefore reduces the possibility of contestability. Okay, and that is a very important point, and it needs to be examined on a case-by-case basis. In a similar way that we wouldn't dream, because it wouldn't make any sense, to force an automotive maker to open up every single of its interfaces between the engine and the steering wheel, between the steering wheel and other connections of the car. We wouldn't dream of asking Volkswagen, for example, to let every single producer of components of automobile, maybe from China or others, to just plug and play their own subsystems within what we consider a more integrated product. In the same way, pushing the notion that that the very notion of service integration is something to be contested, I think is unrealistic. And I think if the objective is to favor contestability, I think there are ways to do that in some cases will look exactly what like this amendment says, but in others will not. And that's why in this case, again, I think it would be very important that the regulator looks on a case-by-case basis as to, in this particular sector, with this particular big platform, given their business model, how to facilitate more contestability in these markets, right? And what we have, I will go for another minute with interoperability, and then I will summarize my argument. With the interoperability, I also agree with what Gareth said, that excessive openness can put ecosystem security and integrity at risk. I agree with that. Where I will not completely agree with Gareth is when Gareth said, it is in the interest of the platforms to make all the members of the ecosystem happy. And they have a natural incentives to basically optimize the welfare of this ecosystem. I will say, in some cases, it might not be true, precisely because platforms and business models of platform often engage subsidy of one side versus another. It's a bit like, George Orwell saying about, everybody is equal, like in Animal Farm, but some people are more equal than others. So the customers who pay will necessarily be driving the incentives of the platform towards what they want more than the customers who don't. That may be moderated if the customers who don't have the possibility to migrate out. But again, in the cases where there is not a viable competition, I will say that even if in the long term, the platforms, absolutely, Gareth I would agree with him. In the long term, platforms' best interest is to make everybody happy. What we see is that we can have, CEOs and decision makers within platforms that are short-sighted, and that could mistakenly, it's not even in their own interest, that could favor one side of the platform versus another. And just like not every company is being directed by managers and CEOs that do always take the best decisions for them, platforms aren't immune to that as well. So what we see now is because of some of these abuses that some platforms have been recognized for, we see that there is a deficit of trust that both in the civil society and in political circles and in policy circles, some of the big platforms are looked at with defiance. And I think some of the platforms are to be blamed for some of their behaviors and the way they've reacted to it. But what I worry about is that we go from one extreme to the next, and then we sort of throw away the baby with the bathwater, because I don't think that would be good for Europe or for its citizens, or for the UK, or for anyone really. So I think that I have a proposition, which is the following, which is that instead of applying the same rule, Lewis mentioned this sort of 20 rules in the DMA, instead of applying the same rules to every one of those gatekeeper platforms, I think it would make a lot more sense to do what the UK is going to do, which is to, first of all, there's not that many of those gatekeepers platforms. So we're not talking about an unmanageable problem, but to have customized code of conduct based on their business model with each of the gatekeeper platforms. I think this customized approach is exactly what the UK is doing. If the UK is doing, I'm not sure why Europe can't. It's got the benefit of targeting a remedy to what the problem is, as opposed to say to a patient, we're going to give you 15 medication because we think you've got one of those diseases, and we're going to throw the whole pharmacy at you. In some cases, given the business model, some practices that a particular firm will do is indeed anti-competitive because of their business model. But that same practice, if it's undertaken by another firm, will not be anti-competitive. So it's a little bit lazy and a little bit dangerous to just want to apply the same rule to all these gatekeeper platforms. I understand perhaps the sentiment for why regulators would be worried to be dragged in lengthy negotiations. They would be a bit perhaps worried to be manipulated by some of the gatekeepers platform. There may be a problem of resourcing there. Some of those gatekeeping platforms have enormous financial resources. And something that I do worry about is that when the DMA gets voted in, how can we make sure that there's enough people that are being employed by the European, Commission, Parliament, and others to make sure that the implementation gets done correctly in a timely fashion without making mistakes? I heard somewhere that there was a plan to have 60 officials to deal with this. I think 600 is more like what we need. Now, maybe the Europe doesn't feel they have the resources to do that. In other industries, some taxes are being levied as those companies that are being regulated, and that can be used. So just to summarize, I think that the DMA is a good thing. I think these amendments are not helpful. I think these amendments hopefully will get, in the negotiation, in the trilogue, there'll be some pushback on that. Hopefully we'll get, in that process to an outcome which is more similar to what the UK is doing, which offer a customized code of conduct that give the right medicine to the right disease, as opposed to throw the whole pharmacy on it. And hopefully there will be adequate resourcing from our regulatory institutions to be able to conduct those analyses on a case-by-case basis, so that the the rules that these gatekeeping platforms will actually have to obey will not take years and years to get designed, and so that the legitimate expectations of European citizens to have access to the best possible, services while their fundamental rights being respected, so that those expectations can be met, so that the European competitiveness can be enhanced by creating an environment, a legal and commercial environment where new platforms can come in and compete for the market or in different technologies. And I think everybody would be better off if the DMA was tweaked in that way, and I think it's still possible to do so. And I think I've covered most of the points I wanted to say. So in the interest of time, I'll just stop here.
Thanks, Annabelle. Also, on this platform, I also need to keep everyone happy, and we've got lots of questions coming in. And so thank you very much. Keep them coming in. What we'll do is we will hear briefly from Kay now, and then we will start to work through the questions. So, Kay.
Thanks. I want to take a very quick step back to look at a little bit at the context here. This kind of reform of competition law in the EU has really started in earnest with this setting up of the platform observatory in 2018, which Professor Gawer was on under DG Connect, and as well this expert report on competition policy for the digital era that was also published in 2019. So a lot of work has been done in these last couple of years. Also a lot of national reports, the Furman report, the Stigler report, the Competition Law 4.0 report, and in all of these, one of the common threads is this acknowledgement that Gareth mentioned, that this conduct is not always harmful necessarily. It's part of how platforms create value, and there are costs to prohibiting it ex ante. But it's clear from the Council General approach adopted on the 25th of November and the Parliament's approval of the DMA report, which is any moment now, I suppose it'll be confirmed. This case by case approach of competition law has been rejected. It's not going to happen. Political decision has been made to accept the economic costs in order to have a more administrable process for government intervention, less checks and balances, less opportunities for gatekeepers or defendants to prove anything opposite, provide defenses or objective justifications or efficiencies. And I think industry just has to accept that going forward. Government will be much more involved in product design decisions ex ante. And going forward, platforms will increasingly need to get permission from enforcers before making any changes to platform services. We're already seeing this in competition enforcement, and I think it'll just be more pervasive under ex ante regulation, as any regulated industry is well aware. Some companies are farther along in accepting this than others, but it can be difficult to accept. It's a big change from ex post competition law, and it's a new way of doing business in Europe in the digital economy. On the other hand, it also means it's a big responsibility for the Commission. The political rhetoric around the DMA is very inspiring. Talk about it increasing innovation and boosting SMEs. I kind of thought the last 2 years have shown that the digital space is already pretty innovative, and SMEs are the main beneficiaries of platform business models. So how much better can it get? That's a question for all of us, and especially the policymakers in the audience, and how they can assure that we get those outcomes in a DMA that works and avoid some of the unintended consequences. I mean, the test will really be, will the DMA make things better, or will only a handful of big companies benefit from it? Will it reduce competition between the platforms and really, even cement their positions even further. There's a tension, which I think is today's discussion really brought up well, between good gatekeeping and bad gatekeeping. Sometimes it's referred to as the problem of identifying whether the shepherd is actually a wolf. And it's not always clear cut. And that's kind of why there needs to be some flexibility in the rules. It's easy for a big platform like Epic, which has a successful app store on Windows, to say that its payment system should be trusted as much as Apple's payment system. But applying that same rule to all potential business users and beneficiaries of the DMA could have a lot of these unintended consequences. When was the last time you went to a random website which you didn't know before? Did you hesitate to put in your credit card details to make a purchase? Or did you prefer to make your purchase instead from a platform you knew and trusted? The DMA, and particularly some of these amendments, would make it much harder for platforms to police their platforms and otherwise create value in their ecosystems. They take away a lot of these values of aggregation and gatekeeping and turn them into intermediaries, infrastructure, common carriers. That's a lot of value that could be lost in Europe's digital economy. And I know there's a lot of mistrust of platforms as well these days in policy circles and in the media. A lot of voices assume that platform operators have bad intentions, that concerns around effects on SMEs or consumers are entirely fabricated, and that we don't need to listen to the advice of experts, that the answers are simple and straightforward. But that kind of polarized opinion won't lead to good results. I think Trilogue negotiations will have to dig into the details, and enforcers ultimately will need to have the space to objectively consider the trade-offs inherent in product design decisions. For the DMA to deliver on its promise to be workable in practice, it needs to be more tailored. And there's already elements of that in the specification process of Article 7, where the Commission has to specify the obligations proportionately and in light of the specific market circumstances. I think the Council text in this respect has a lot of improvements, and it doesn't require fundamentally changing the DMA. These adjustment mechanisms can be expanded upon. And that these unintended consequences of the DMA can still be addressed by providing more clarity in the specification process to ensure that gatekeepers won't be punished for keeping their customers safe. I think that would help make the DMA truly fit for the digital age.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we've got plenty of questions coming in, so let's see how many we can rattle through. Some of them probably require shorter answers, others maybe more discursive ones, but yeah, let's start. First one is designation thresholds. No one's really mentioned that. Debate tends to be those who are in will know they're in, whether or not you move the threshold by a few billion here or there. And obviously there's a next ring out of companies who might get caught. Question is therefore, should the designation thresholds be moved? Who wants to go first? Okay.
I mean, I think there's something in that question that is kind of, there's an assumption there that only those companies that are going to be caught by the thresholds or that are above the thresholds are going to be affected by the DMA. And I just don't see that as being realistic. The whole concept of the DMA is that there's a lot of companies, business users that are relying on platform services. So when you change the platform services, a lot of companies are going to be affected, the companies that use these platform services. And then as well, you know, that threshold is indicative. The Commission is free to designate foreseeable gatekeepers and go for companies that are below the thresholds. So there's a quantitative and a qualitative element to it. I don't think sort of the threshold is black and white. Otherwise, a platform operator that has, you know, 10,000 business users might say, actually, we only want 9,999 business users. We're only going to allow that many companies to use our marketplace, because otherwise we'll be considered a gatekeeper and subject to all these obligations.
Okay, Gareth, Annabelle?
Yeah, I think Kay's point is an important one. That it is, even within the mechanisms that's already there, only indicative. Not only can the Commission designate somebody who's below the threshold, they can choose not to designate somebody who's above the threshold if they deem that the reasoned submissions are appropriate. I think one thing that I would flag around the threshold approach is that it somewhat ignores the fact that some companies might have power over specific people in a specific setting, but it's not more general. So having this very rigid threshold-based approach could be problematic if you want to protect those consumers. I think there's also something to remember that some of the obligations now, mostly these are sitting in the DSA, the Digital Services Act. Some obligations should belong to everyone, not just large players. And there are articles within the DMA, like some of the data protection articles, that frankly either should be applicable broadly, or I see no reason why that is only applicable to very large firms.
Okay, size not so important. Annabelle, do you agree? You're on mute. You're on mute. I knew someone would be throughout this call. It was going to be me.
Happy to oblige. Yeah, I mean, the question of the threshold is an important one. When we say threshold, we assume that we know the dimension on which, there is a below and there is an above. Is it, the turnover? Is it the profitability? Is it the number of users? Is it the number of complementary markets that are associated with the underlying core services? Some of it is ambiguous. I think some of that ambiguity is bad. I think some of that ambiguity is nevertheless unavoidable. So what I would like to suggest is rather than trying to get it right completely from the start, is that we have in the law a process by which every year, for example, there would be a reevaluation of what will be for that year, the rule, so transparency of the rule, so that there is, what we don't want is a black box where some administrators are going to decide in a way that is unchallengeable and unclear, and perhaps why this company is going to be considered a gatekeeper and not another one. So I think what is being asked of the platform should be also asked of the regulator, which is transparency, a method of recourse, and perhaps because it's a very dynamic market, an agreement on the process that would say every year or every, it can't be too short, it can't be every 6 months, it can't be every 5 years, something a bit in between, where there would be a revisiting of what this means to be considered a gatekeeper, and that the rule would be applied in a fair manner. So that would be my remark.
Thank you. Next question. This is a little bit more specific. How will specific sectors such as operating systems and cloud services be impacted by the new reforms and potential over-regulation? So will the DMA over-regulate sectors such as operating systems and cloud services? I mean, Gareth, you dealt with operating systems in your opening speech. Cloud systems, I'm not sure if cloud systems are in, but or in whose version they're in. Anyone like to take that? Gareth?
I'm happy to start. I think the overarching comment I would make is that the one-size-fits-all approach means, yes, I think there probably are examples that we can draw of where there will be over-regulation on a specific sector because it's not the, let's call it the intended target of a particular obligation. And I'm afraid it's neither an OS nor a cloud service, but the example we drew out about OTAs, online travel agents, is an example of where a obligation that was designed with something in mind. In that particular case, I think it was in-app purchases that it has in mind, is having a detrimental effect in another area. So for an online travel agent, you need to be able to charge the people who are using your platform when you put them in touch with someone. That's the commission-based model, and you're putting their business model at risk if you don't allow that. I'm sure, I don't know, with my co-panelists have got examples where that might crop up with an OS or a cloud provider in particular.
Thanks. Any views on sectors which will get impacted unexpectedly?
Well, perhaps the sectors aren't going to be regulated, companies are, right? So companies are going to be regulated, and they're going to be regulated if only some of their activities meet a certain threshold or certain characteristics. Okay. Now, it is true that if we think about cloud computing, and that they do have some infrastructural qualities. So I heard a case point that the concern that we don't want to go towards too much a model of regulating platforms like as if they were utilities. And I understand the concern of that. On the other hand, the biggest platforms do offer a kind of infrastructure, privately regulated infrastructure. And cloud computing is certainly that. So what do we mean here by infrastructure? Is a service that a very large number of people and organizations depend upon. That's the sense in which I use that word. I don't use it in any other way, right? So the question was, is there a risk that this particular sector may be over-regulated? Well, I think it depends. If you think that a resource that so many other users depend upon should not be regulated or should be regulated, what would constitute over-regulation? Is very much into the sort of the premise of that question.
Yep. Okay.
I'm old enough to remember back when Steve Jobs left Apple and then came back to Apple, and they were really reinvigorated, and they had this great ad campaign to contrast themselves with Windows. I'm a PC, I'm a Mac. And one of their big selling points was that because of the operating system's more closed environment, it was more secure. There was less malware, less viruses. And that was a selling point. That was a marketing point. And it was true. And it brought on a lot of new users, people who maybe a Windows PC, they were familiar with it at work, but at home they wanted a Mac. They wanted for their kids, it's easier to use and less at risk. The DMA's sort of one size fits all approach on this says, well, every operating system has to be operated the same way with some of these amendments with full open access to every aspect of the hardware and software that any potential rival or business user would want access to. That's 6.1F. Again, it's kind of like taking away some of this gatekeeping role, and it could make a return to these kind of less secure environments.
I mean, on that point, Kay, I think there's one of the amendments that we've looked at talks about other settings within 6.1F, I want to say, the sub-referencing obligations. So taking it beyond just ranking services and now starting to apply those obligations which were designed with one setting in mind, rankings of third parties alongside your own offerings, and starting to apply that to other settings, which could be any sort of settings within an operating system or a piece of hardware or a cloud system. And it moves you away from that it just works offering into you must set before you could actually use anything. And that has a knock-on effect both on consumers and their experience, but also on developers and competition on the platform. Because as a developer on a platform, I want to know that when I use a particular piece of, particular API or particular piece of common code, it's going to work. That could be on a cloud, in a cloud setting, that could be on an OS. Without those settings being in place, I can't have that guarantee. I have to trust that the user has set things up properly. I've only got to think to my soundbar set up in my living room, which never seems to connect to the device that I wanted to connect to know how frustrated it is when it doesn't connect in the way I expect it to.
Thanks. Okay, we've got there's two questions which I'll sort of merge together, somewhat more philosophical perhaps. If the DMA is about, not on the one hand, curbing the power of large companies over certain platforms, but on the other hand, they're doing that. It does that in order to open up powers, the ability for European SMEs to get onto the market and to compete, to make the markets more contestable, which is Annabelle's word. The questions are essentially, do you think European companies need any more help to compete? I think, the DMA will do this, will open the door, but what other measures are needed in order to help European companies sort of step through that door and actually compete? The answer could be no, nothing. This is it. This is it. This is a pretty big piece of legislation, and there you go. We've opened the door. It's up to you to walk through it. That's the question. Is that should there be any additional measures either within the DMA or elsewhere in the legislative toolbox to help competition? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start.
Go, Annabelle.
Absolutely, I think that a lot could be done to increase, entrepreneurship and innovation and likelihood of succeeding for SMEs and for European companies in general. The first one has to do with really delivering a unified digital single market and to lower the administrative complexities resulting from different local rules. And I think some progress has been made, but we're not there yet. That's the first thing. And I think regulators have done some good work, and there needs to continue. The other one is having to do with access to capital, access to capital, facilitating with measures having to do with taxation, for example. Not only had to provide tax incentives for startups, but also tax incentive for companies who are successful startups and want to scale up. And I know several entrepreneurs who say that they don't want to grow too much, because if they grow beyond a certain threshold, here we go again, the notion of threshold, they're going to lose some of the subsidies. So that is an easy win, right? That is an easy thing that regulators can do to make sure that the tax aid and the financial incentives are there, not just to start a company, but to scale it. And the third point I think is very important, has to do with education. I think that a lot of the European companies and European citizens and European engineers and European entrepreneurs don't have yet an adequate and appropriate understanding of the opportunities open in the digital economy to create value. It's all very opaque. It all looks very techy. It looks very remote. And Europe has been very avid consumers of tech platforms, but it's not rocket science to actually understand how the digital economy and the new technological conditions can help create value in different ways. And doesn't mean everybody has to learn to code, doesn't mean everybody has to transform themselves into a software programmer. But I think from universities, and we do that at the University of Surrey, courses on the business of platforms, business opportunities opened by the digital economy, how to win, how to compete. I think that has to become general culture. And so I think I offered and that was the spirit of the book that I wrote with Marco Somano from MIT and David Yaffe from Harvard Business School, which is called The Business of Platforms, is to try to translate in plain language, how you can create your own platform, how you can compete with some of these companies. There's still a lot of problems that can be solved. And obviously, I think there's a lot of room to solve these problems, and not in a lazy way, but just, treating all your workforce as if they were, independent workers and saving on cost having to do with social guarantees and social securities, not just by transforming your workers into slaves, but by really tapping into the possibility of value creation and competing intelligently with existing platforms and existing companies. Because as big and powerful as these companies are, they have some blind angles, and they have some limitation in the way they create value, which is associated with their business model. And so there's a lot more that can be done, and I think the regulators can have a role in that.
Thank you. So, Kay, the DMA, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Does it need help? Do the SMEs of Europe need help drinking, or this is it?
I mean, I agree with everything Professor Gawer said. I think there's, in addition, access to capital sort of rewards for entrepreneurship, and talent, attracting talent and promoting talent. But what the first thing that Professor Gawer mentioned on the digital single market, that's one of the objectives of the DMA. It's to deepen the single market and make sure that there's a harmonized approach to the regulation. A lot of SMEs, if you look at the study into e-commerce that the Commission did not so long ago, found that a lot of these smaller businesses were using platforms, leveraging them as a sort of a single source gateway to the whole European market, to and all of its customers. And that kind of handling payment services, tax, single place to do complaints handling across all of Europe, logistics, marketing, all this stuff that is able to be done in a one-stop shop way on a digital platform. That kind of benefit and strengthening of the digital market, it can be maintained if there is a harmonized approach to how the DMA rules and platform rules in general apply. If a French enforcer makes decisions for France on the interpretation, and a German one in Germany, and in different member states each take bits and pieces out of the DMA to apply themselves and fragment the rules, then that would mean that that's one-stop shop benefit is kind of lost. So I think the DMA itself can be improved in some ways by making sure it really does harmonize the platform rules. And then if the Commission says something is okay, then it's okay across all of Europe, and it's not going to be up for other member states to step in and try to carve out a different interpretation of the rules.
Thanks. I'm going to just take your point there about digital single market and fragmentation, and just meld it with another question that's come in and put it to Gareth. And this is about the impact of the DMA on a global scale, on the effect of innovation on a global scale, and where it will put Europe. I mean, it's a predictive game, but where it will put Europe compared to the US and compared to China in the years to come. Care to take a guess, or a well-informed, economically well-founded prognosis, Gareth?
My economically well-founded guess, yeah. No, I would. When we were listening to Kay and Annabelle, I think on the previous point, I agree with a lot of what you were saying, and my thoughts there were going straight into your question. Actually, I think we sometimes forget that there's two groups of beneficiaries from when we think about contestability through the DMA. There's people who are using platforms to access their customer base, and SMEs and other European businesses that are doing that. And then there's potential competitors to these platforms. I think we meld the two in our minds a bit and think, do we need more help contesting these platforms? Well, do we need to? Actually, Europe's got strengths in other areas. It's easy to forget that something like 90% of the world's smartphones are powered by chips that were built just outside, or designed, I should say, just outside Cambridge. And these are enormously successful companies. We've got big fintech companies having a lot of success as well. Biotech firms are having a lot of success in Europe. And leveling up the digital markets should help these firms. I'm not sure we should over obsessed with having the next great search engine or the next great social media platform coming from Europe. We've got other advantages with the industrial Internet of Things coming down the track. Again, this is an area that Europe's well positioned to take on through things like connected car, connected cities, these type of questions. So my proposition would be not to worry too much whether we have the next Google is European, worry more about how we're supporting our startups in the areas where we have comparative advantage to build those out and think about how the DMA and other anti-fragmentation positions can help with that. And very briefly on the point of fragmentation, it's something that came up in some work we were doing around the DSA, the Digital Services Act. We found there that some people were saying it is easier for them to scale in South America than it is to scale in Europe. It happened to be a Spanish company. They said, look, we've got language benefits in South America. It is easier for us to scale there than it is to scale in Europe, given the fragmentation of the legal environment outside of, there's a few things that are well harmonized, but then there remains a lot of stuff around employment, around financing, around regulatory filing, such like remains very unharmonized, and that was a good example of how those barriers still exist.
Thanks, Gareth. Time's running, so I'll move on to the next topic, which is just to come back to the DMA amendments. There was a push at the 11th hour inside the European Parliament to get the DMA to have stronger wording on killer acquisitions or on the obligations or powers of the regulator to intervene on these M&A deals. Essentially, all that's in there is the strongest possible wording that you can have for please tell us about your deals. Obviously, there are parallel initiatives that the European Commission has under merger law and so forth, which would allow what the Commission argues allows it to get their hands on such transactions, but the DMA is not necessarily the avenue for this. Perhaps I could get your views on the DMA and whether it is a missed opportunity to police or to turn the screw on these kinds of deals, or whether it really is the wrong place for it. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of arguments about legal basis, but the M&A part, the kill acquisition part, is very much part of this whole debate, is very much part of platform growth, size, ecosystems and so forth. So who wants to go first on that? Kay.
I think this, to me, is kind of part of the narrative in the sense that it's another avenue of trying to restrain the size of big tech platforms and looking at the ways they've grown and trying to target that kind of stuff. It's doesn't seem to be trying to address a particular harm. It's hard to see, where has there been harm? And if we talk about access to capital, if you prevent, 5 of the biggest potential bidders in an auction process from participating, those European startups that are going to make a lot of money and sell potentially to whoever, if you take out 5 of the bidders from that room, the remaining bidders are going to lowball the offer and get those startups at a much cheaper price. So it's the impact that this kind of a prohibition could have needs to be really carefully looked at. It wasn't looked at in the impact assessment, and so it would be quite a uncharted territory in a way to put a broad-based prohibition on acquisitions, on small-scale acquisitions, on so-called killer acquisitions in the DMA, putting aside arguments around the legal basis.
Annabelle?
Yes, so in the report that I co-authored for the European Parliament, I touched upon that. The concern has been, right, that over the almost 500 acquisitions that some of the biggest platforms, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple, have done over the last 10 years, the concern has been that some of them were motivated and or had the effect of snuffing potential rivals, right? That these acquisitions were either motivated by or had the effect of preventing new rivals to get to a scale where they could have potentially dislodged the existing platforms. It's very hard to know exposed what was the motivation of those acquisitions. And it's also very hard to know empirically what the counterfactual would have been. That is, what would have happened if Instagram had been, left alone. Okay. However, I think the concern that a small number of firms can use their very deep pockets to try to systematically snuff out competition is a very legitimate concern. The incentives would be there. And so what I was suggesting in the report, and what I think might be a good way forward, is to, for a small subset of very big platforms, to reverse the burden of proof that this acquisition would be beneficial. Obviously, this is also very difficult to prove in advance that something that's going to happen is going to have beneficial effects. So this is not a clear-cut area where you can neither say, retrospectively, what were people thinking and why did they do this, or to plan, the future as to what would be the effect. And I do think that there hasn't been enough empirical studies as to these acquisitions, and part of it's impossible to tell. But given the fact that I think Europe wants to increase the likelihood that there are new competitors, I think a strengthening of that merger control, a smart strengthening, again, not a one-size-fits-all ban, but a customized, inquiry and a process as to how will everyone be better off, I think is a good thing. The last point I want to react on is Kay was mentioning that from the entrepreneur's perspective, these entrepreneurs who, many of them, their exit strategy is to be bought up by Google or Amazon, right? What would that do to their incentives if they can't, cash out, right? I'm a little less worried about that. I think that from a society's perspective, society's objective should not necessarily to maximize the profit of the entrepreneurs, if the effect would be to maintain artificially some sort of barriers to entry. So I don't think we want to prejudge that the acquisitions are necessarily bad. Some of them, of course, because of the financial resources as well as the access to customer, big platforms acquiring some services make some of these acquisitions, the services offered, they make them accessible and by a large number of users. There is, however, a mixed bag there where it could also potentially be seen as a way to snuff out competition. And again, my suggestion would be to look on a case by case basis.
Thank you. Very brief, we've got 2 minutes left. So Gareth, 1 minute on mergers, and then Kay.
A very brief 1 minute on mergers. I think it's important to think of one of the features that we observe with the platform literature talks about is what's described as an inversion of the firm. So firms are encouraging people to innovate on their platform, and you get this mechanism of people trying out different things. When they work, it might be efficient to embed that into the broader platform.
Just blocked the 11th hour. The 11th hour. You okay?
I'm back. It might be better it might be efficient to embed those into the platform. And I think you have this question of what happens if the platform isn't able to do that. Maybe there becomes more competition for those ideas and that labor in the first place, and they end up just going in-house at those firms and building. I think that inverted firm notion is an important one to think about. I think the point that Annabelle touched on as well about the rollout of an idea. If you are able to scale an idea because it's been bought by a big tech platform, when we look at how innovation drives benefit for consumers, rolling out an innovation to a large number of people is where a large percentage of the value comes from. People always think about the breakthrough new idea, but actually taking the existing ideas and spreading them far and wide at an affordable cost is also an important aspect of value creation.
Can I just react on that very, very briefly? Every system, whether it's a technological system, an economic system, a political system, there are some advantages of a centralized planning and control economy, like the Soviet Union, right? And there's some advantages of having a decentralized, more market-based economy, right? The argument of efficiency, if centralized, is a good one. And in many ways, China, it's not a democratic country, but they were very efficient at handling, COVID, right? You would go to jail if you would step into the street, right? So the question, obviously, is that of the trade-off between efficiency, which could, if the whole world is much more efficient, if so many things can be governed centrally by the big platforms, we get to a point where the efficiency, there may be a trade-off with the contestability, right? And so I would say that while I agree with the point about efficiency, I would like to put it into a wider context, that acknowledging the trade-offs there are very important, because there comes a point where, when there is no more competition, a system that maybe was efficient turns into something a little more sinister. And I'm not suggesting that that's what's happening, but I'm just saying, let's be careful about this centralized efficiency argument.
Okay, thank you. Okay, final minute. We're over on the mergers point.
Yeah, no. What I said before on mergers, still not much more to add, really.
Okay, then we're 2 minutes over. That's my fault. I apologize. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the participants for being so eloquent and fluid in their points. I think we've all learned a lot, and all bomb ahead to the trilogues next month. We'll see all those carefully crafted positions torn up and thrown subject to some ugly political compromises, but that's how legislation is made. I'd like to thank Pub Affairs for inviting me to moderate it. I've been Lewis Crofts, editor-in-chief of MLex. Also, I've just seen it, I look like some sort of icon from a Russian Orthodox church, given the sort of halo effect around my around my head. I've been told that the video will be put online in due course, so you can all relive the magic with your families. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much to the panelists, and stay safe and have a nice Christmas.
Thank you, Lewis.
Thanks, Lewis. Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.